Have you ever stopped to consider that everything you've been taught about the most pivotal moment in human history might be completely wrong? What if I told you that the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the very foundation upon which Christianity stands, didn't happen the way billions of believers have been told for over 2,000 years? What if the empty tomb, the physical appearances to the disciples, and the promise of bodily resurrection were all misunderstood fragments of a much deeper, more profound spiritual truth? But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. This isn't just another theological debate or academic discussion. This is about a revelation so shocking, so transformative, that it has the power to completely revolutionize your understanding of faith, death, and the very meaning of eternal life itself. Has this ever happened to you? That moment when everything you thought you knew suddenly shifts, revealing a truth so magnificent that it changes your entire worldview. The man who brought this earth-shattering revelation to light was Edgar Cayce, known worldwide as the Sleeping Prophet. Through his extraordinary ability to access what he called the Akashic Records, the universe's eternal memory bank, Cayce unveiled secrets about Christ's resurrection that directly challenged 2 millennia of established Christian doctrine. His vision wasn't just controversial, it was revolutionary, suggesting that the greatest miracle in human history wasn't what we've been led to believe. For generations, the Christian faith has rested upon a singular, unwavering narrative. Jesus died on the cross, was buried in a tomb, and on the 3rd day rose again in physical form. The Gospels tell us the tomb was found empty, that he appeared to Mary Magdalene, walked with disciples on the road to Emmaus, and even invited Thomas to touch his wounds. This physical resurrection became the cornerstone of Christianity, the promise that death could be conquered, that our own bodies would one day be raised incorruptible. But what if this interpretation, while beautiful and comforting, missed the most profound truth of all? What if the real miracle wasn't about flesh and bone returning to life, but about something infinitely more magnificent? The triumph of eternal consciousness over the illusion of death itself. Stay with me until the end of this exploration, because what you're about to discover might not only surprise you, it might fundamentally transform how you understand the deepest mysteries of existence. Cayce's revelation doesn't diminish the power of Christ's victory. Instead, it elevates it to dimensions we never imagined possible. The implications of this alternative understanding ripple far beyond religious doctrine. They touch the very core of human experience, our relationship with mortality, our understanding of consciousness, and our potential for spiritual transcendence. What you're about to learn challenges not just what happened in that tomb in Jerusalem, but what resurrection truly means for every soul seeking truth in this vast, mysterious universe. The journey we're about to embark upon will take us deep into the mystical insights of one of history's most remarkable spiritual visionaries. And what we discover there may forever change how you see the greatest story ever told. If you're drawn to these deeper spiritual insights, I'd appreciate having you subscribe. There's so much more we can discover together about consciousness and ancient wisdom. The truth is, when you really examine the foundation upon which Christianity built its promise of eternal life, you begin to see cracks in what was once considered an unshakable bedrock of faith. For centuries, the Church has taught that our hope for life beyond death rests entirely on that singular moment when Christ's physical body supposedly emerged from the tomb. This one event became the golden thread connecting every believer's deepest longing for immortality to a historical occurrence that happened over 2,000 years ago. But here's where the journey of hidden truth begins to reveal its most fascinating secrets. When scholars and historians step behind the scenes of the Gospel accounts, applying rigorous analysis to these sacred texts, something remarkable emerges. The differences between the four gospel narratives aren't just minor variations in storytelling. They're significant enough to suggest that what we're reading might be carefully constructed accounts designed to serve a specific purpose, consolidating a young, fragile faith movement that desperately needed unity and certainty. Think about it for a moment. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John each tell the resurrection story with subtle but important differences. Who arrived at the tomb first? What exactly did they find? How many angels were there? These aren't trivial details when you're talking about the most important event in human spiritual history. These gaps and contradictions create space for questions that traditional doctrine has been reluctant to explore. The most intriguing aspect of this entire mystery is what's missing from the historical record. Despite the magnitude of what supposedly occurred, the dead returning to life, the earth shaking, the veil of the temple tearing, there's a conspicuous absence of contemporary documentation from non-Christian sources. Roman historians, Jewish chroniclers, and other record keepers of the time remain remarkably silent about what should have been the most extraordinary event ever witnessed. This absence of material evidence doesn't necessarily invalidate the spiritual significance of what happened, but it does open the door to alternative interpretations that go far beyond the literal. What if the real transformation wasn't about conquering physical death, but about revealing a deeper truth about the nature of consciousness itself? What if the empty tomb wasn't proof of bodily resurrection, but a symbol of something infinitely more profound about human potential and spiritual awakening? Edgar Cayce's revelations suggest that we've been looking at this mystery from entirely the wrong angle. Instead of focusing on what happened to flesh and bone, we should be examining what happened to consciousness, to spirit, to the eternal essence that transcends all material limitations. This shift in perspective doesn't diminish the power of Christ's victory. It transforms it into something that touches every human soul on the most fundamental level. The impact of this alternative understanding ripples through every aspect of how we approach spirituality, mortality, and our own journey of transformation. It suggests that the resurrection wasn't just something that happened to Jesus, but something that represents a universal potential within human consciousness itself. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic and explore exactly how Edgar Cayce received these revolutionary insights that challenge everything we thought we knew about the most pivotal moment in spiritual history. Write in the comments, ready for the deeper truth, if this perspective is opening new doors of understanding for you. Edgar Cayce's journey into these profound revelations began with a radical shift in mindset that most people find difficult to embrace. He understood that even the most sacred truths must be examined through the lens of genuine spiritual inquiry, not blind acceptance. What's remarkable is that when you approach the biblical texts themselves with this open perspective, you discover that they actually contain built-in invitations for deeper interpretation. Consider how the gospel writers themselves seem to acknowledge the mysterious nature of what they're describing. When the disciples encounter the risen Christ, there's always something different, something that challenges immediate recognition. Mary Magdalene mistakes him for a gardener. The disciples on the road to Emmaus walk with him for hours without knowing who he is. Even when Jesus appears to the 11, some worship while others doubt. These details aren't accidental. They're clues pointing toward an experience that transcends ordinary physical reality. This is where Cayce's revelations become truly transformative in their impact on our understanding. What if these encounters weren't failures of recognition, but accurate descriptions of contact with a consciousness that had evolved beyond the limitations of physical form? The disciples weren't confused or mistaken. They were witnessing something unprecedented in human experience, a being who had successfully completed the ultimate transformation from material to spiritual existence. The tension between taking these accounts literally versus understanding them symbolically has shaped religious thought for centuries. Traditional Christianity chose the literal path, creating doctrines that require believers to accept physical resurrection as historical fact. But there's another journey of interpretation that doesn't require us to abandon reason or spiritual discernment. If this shifted your perspective in any way, A-like helps these conversations reach other seekers ready for this understanding. When you examine the behind-the-scenes context of how these stories were preserved and transmitted, you realize that the early Christian communities were grappling with the same questions we face today. How do you communicate a spiritual experience so profound that human language struggles to contain it? How do you describe an encounter with consciousness that has transcended every limitation we associate with human existence? Cayce's insights suggest that what the disciples experienced were genuine spiritual visions, not hallucinations or wishful thinking, but authentic contact with Jesus in his transformed state. This doesn't diminish the reality of their experiences. It elevates them to a dimension where the boundaries between physical and spiritual reality become meaningless. In this understanding, the resurrection becomes not just a historical event, but a revelation about the true nature of consciousness itself. This perspective opens up extraordinary possibilities for our own spiritual journey. If Jesus demonstrated that consciousness can transcend physical death, then the resurrection becomes a preview of human potential rather than a unique divine intervention. Every person carries within themselves the seed of this same transformation, the same capacity to evolve beyond material limitations. The hidden truth that Cayce uncovered suggests that the real miracle wasn't bringing a body back to life, but proving that life itself, consciousness, spirit, the essence of who we are, was never dependent on physical form in the first place. This revelation fundamentally changes our relationship with mortality, shifting us from fear-based thinking to an understanding of death as transformation rather than ending. What's particularly powerful about this interpretation is how it bridges the gap between different spiritual traditions while honoring the unique contribution of Christ's example. Instead of making Christianity exclusive, it reveals universal principles about consciousness and transcendence that resonate across all authentic spiritual paths. Now let me share with you the specific details of how Edgar Cayce accessed this information and what he discovered about the actual process of Jesus' transformation from physical to spiritual existence. Write in the comments, "Consciousness beyond form," if you're beginning to see how this changes everything we thought we knew about life and death. Edgar Cayce wasn't operating in a spiritual vacuum when he received these revelations about Christ's true resurrection. What makes his insights so compelling is how they align with ancient wisdom traditions that existed long before Christianity consolidated its official doctrine. These early spiritual movements, many of which were later suppressed or forgotten, spoke extensively about luminous bodies that could be freed from the constraints of physical matter through deep spiritual transformation. In the Gnostic traditions, for example, there were detailed teachings about the body of light that advanced souls could develop and inhabit after transcending material existence. Egyptian mystery schools taught about the Ka and Ba, subtle energy bodies that represented different aspects of consciousness beyond the physical form. Hindu and Buddhist traditions spoke of similar concepts, describing how enlightened masters could manifest in bodies of pure consciousness, unbound by the limitations of flesh and bone. The profound impact of understanding this historical context cannot be overstated. It reveals that Cayce's vision of Jesus' resurrection wasn't some radical departure from spiritual wisdom, but actually a return to ancient truths that had been systematically obscured by institutional religious decisions made centuries after Christ's actual lifetime. The early church fathers made deliberate choices about which interpretations to promote and which to suppress, often based more on political and social considerations than purely spiritual ones. This creates an extraordinary space for genuine spiritual inquiry, where doubt isn't the enemy of faith but rather its most honest companion. When you allow yourself to question not the reality of Christ's triumph over death, but rather the mechanism by which that triumph was achieved, you open doorways to understanding that literal interpretations simply cannot provide. The journey becomes one of exploration rather than blind acceptance, of discovery rather than mere belief. Throughout history, some of the most profound spiritual thinkers have grappled with this exact question. Why would a consciousness that had achieved ultimate spiritual transcendence choose to re-enter the limitations of physical form? What would be the purpose of returning to a body when the entire message was about overcoming material constraints? These weren't rebellious thoughts or attacks on faith. They were sincere attempts to understand the deeper mechanics of spiritual transformation. Mystics like Meister Eckhart, John of the Cross, and even more, recent spiritual teachers have all pointed toward the same fundamental truth. The ultimate spiritual achievement isn't the resurrection of matter, but the recognition that consciousness itself is eternal and was never truly bound by material form in the first place. This doesn't diminish Christ's accomplishment, it magnifies it by revealing a victory so complete that even the illusion of physical death was transcended. Cayce's revelation suggests that Jesus demonstrated something far more revolutionary than bringing a corpse back to life. He proved that what we consider death is actually just a transition, a shedding of one form of existence for another, more expansive one. The real miracle wasn't in the flesh returning, but in consciousness revealing its true nature as unlimited, eternal, and fundamentally free from all material constraints. This understanding transforms our entire relationship with mortality and opens up possibilities for our own spiritual journey that go far beyond traditional religious promises. It suggests that the path Jesus walked isn't unique to him, but represents a potential that exists within every conscious being willing to undertake the radical transformation required to access it. But here's where Cayce's specific revelations become even more fascinating, because he didn't just theorize about these possibilities. He described in remarkable detail exactly how Jesus accomplished this transformation and what his post-crucifixion existence actually looked like. Write in the comments, ancient wisdom returning, if you're recognizing how these timeless truths are finally coming back to light. Edgar Cayce's emergence as the sleeping prophet wasn't the result of some calculated decision to challenge religious doctrine, but rather an extraordinary journey of consciousness that began in his childhood in rural Kentucky. What made Cayce so remarkable wasn't just his ability to access profound spiritual information, but the utterly humble and genuine way he approached these gifts that would eventually transform thousands of lives. The behind-the-scenes story of how Cayce discovered his abilities is fascinating in itself. As a young man struggling with a throat condition that threatened to end his career, he found that by entering a deep trance state, he could diagnose his own condition and prescribe treatments that conventional medicine couldn't provide. But what started as personal healing quickly evolved into something far more extraordinary. In these altered states of consciousness, Cayce could access information about any person, any condition, and eventually any spiritual question put before him. For those who resonate with this kind of exploration, subscribing means joining a community ready to dive into transformative spiritual wisdom. The impact of his revelations about Christ's resurrection didn't come from a place of religious rebellion or intellectual skepticism. Cayce was actually a devout Christian who taught Sunday school for decades. His shocking insights about Jesus emerged not from a desire to undermine faith, but from direct access to what he called the universal records of consciousness, a cosmic library containing the truth about every soul's journey throughout time. When Cayce's consciousness would shift into these profound trance states, something remarkable happened. His ordinary personality, with all its limitations and preconceptions, would step aside, allowing a deeper intelligence to speak through him. This intelligence had access to information that challenged conventional understanding, not to destroy faith, but to reveal its deeper foundation. The thousands of people who witnessed these sessions described feeling as though they were in the presence of something genuinely sacred, something that connected them to truths their hearts recognized, even when their minds struggled to accept them. What makes Cayce's revelations about Jesus so compelling is that they didn't emerge from theological study or philosophical speculation. They came through direct spiritual perception during altered states of consciousness that allowed him to witness the actual mechanics of Christ's transformation. According to Cayce, what happened in that tomb wasn't a reversal of death, but a completion of life's ultimate purpose, the full realization of consciousness freed from all material limitations. The revolutionary nature of this understanding cannot be overstated. Cayce described Jesus' post-crucifixion state not as a return to physical existence, but as a graduation into a form of consciousness so expanded and luminous that it could interact with the physical world without being bound by its laws. This explains why the Gospel accounts describe such puzzling details about the resurrection appearances, the sudden appearances and disappearances, the difficulty with recognition, the ability to pass through walls while still maintaining recognizable form. For Cayce, this represented the ultimate spiritual achievement, the destination toward which all conscious evolution points. Jesus didn't return from death because death, as we understand it, never actually occurred. What appeared to be death was actually the final shedding of everything that had limited his consciousness, allowing his true nature as eternal spirit to manifest fully. This transformation in understanding has profound implications for how we approach our own spiritual journey, because it suggests that what Jesus demonstrated isn't unique to him, but represents the ultimate potential of human consciousness itself. Now, let me reveal the specific details of what Cayce discovered about Jesus' actual condition after the crucifixion and how this changes everything we thought we knew about the nature of life and death. Write in the comments, direct spiritual perception. If you're beginning to understand how true spiritual knowledge comes not from books, but from expanded consciousness itself. The Akashic records, as Cayce described them, aren't some mystical library tucked away in some ethereal dimension. They represent something far more profound, the fundamental memory of consciousness itself, where every thought, every decision, every transformation that has ever occurred throughout the entire journey of existence is permanently recorded. When Cayce entered his deepest trance states, he claimed to access this universal database of spiritual truth, gaining insights that no amount of scholarly study or theological training could provide. What's remarkable about his access to these records is how the information came through. Cayce himself often had no conscious memory of what he had revealed during his readings. He would emerge from these profound states having delivered detailed, life-changing insights about subjects he had never studied, speaking with an authority and depth of knowledge that seemed to come from a source far beyond his normal, waking consciousness. The hidden truth he discovered about Jesus' resurrection emerged from this same direct spiritual perception. According to these revelations, Jesus had already completed his earthly mission before the crucifixion even occurred. The physical death on the cross wasn't the beginning of a miraculous return to life, but rather the final act of releasing every remaining attachment to material existence. Cayce's insights suggest that by the time Jesus spoke his last words, his consciousness had already transcended the need for physical form entirely. The body that hung on the cross had become merely a vessel that was no longer necessary for his continued existence. This understanding completely reframes our entire mindset about what happened in that tomb. Instead of a corpse being miraculously reanimated, we're looking at a consciousness so evolved that it had moved beyond the very concept of physical death. The empty tomb wasn't evidence of resurrection. It was evidence of transformation so complete that material form was no longer required. Jesus hadn't returned to his body. He had evolved beyond any need for it. The impact of this revelation goes far beyond challenging religious doctrine. It suggests that what we call death is actually just a transition point in consciousness, not an ending, but a graduation to expanded forms of existence. Jesus demonstrated that this transformation was possible not just for him, but potentially for anyone willing to undertake the profound spiritual journey required to achieve it. Cayce's interpretation places Jesus' victory not in conquering death as we understand it, but in proving that consciousness itself is eternal and was never actually limited by physical form in the first place. This shifts the entire focus from a miracle that happened to one person 2,000 years ago to a universal principle about the nature of awareness itself that applies to every conscious being. The journey that Jesus completed represents the ultimate destination of human spiritual evolution, the full realization that we are consciousness having a physical experience, not physical beings having occasional spiritual moments. His post-crucifixion appearances weren't returns from death, but demonstrations of what consciousness looks like when it's no longer constrained by material limitations. But here's where Cayce's revelations become even more specific and transformative, because he didn't just describe what happened to Jesus. He detailed exactly how this expanded consciousness could manifest and interact with those still operating within physical reality. Write in the comments, "Universal memory accessed," if you're beginning to see how spiritual truth transcends all the limitations of traditional religious teaching. The profound shift in understanding that Cayce brought forward transforms Jesus from a distant historical figure into a living example of what human consciousness can achieve when it fully awakens to its true nature. This isn't about diminishing Christ's significance. It's about recognizing that his greatest gift to humanity wasn't dying for our sins, but demonstrating the spiritual transformation that every soul has the potential to experience. When you approach Jesus as a model of expanded consciousness, rather than simply as a divine figure who performed impossible miracles, something extraordinary happens to your own spiritual journey. The resurrection becomes not just something to believe in, but something to aspire to. The victory over death becomes not just Christ's unique achievement, but a preview of the transformation available to anyone willing to undertake the profound inner work required to transcend material limitations. The resistance that Cayce faced from religious authorities of his time reveals the deep challenge that this understanding presents to institutional faith. Church leaders weren't just protecting doctrine, they were protecting an entire system built on the premise that spiritual truth must be mediated through external authority rather than discovered through direct inner experience. The impact of Cayce's revelations threatened to make every individual their own spiritual authority, capable of accessing divine truth through expanded consciousness. But here's what makes Cayce's approach so compelling. He never positioned himself as an enemy of faith. His courage in challenging established dogma came from a place of profound reverence for spiritual truth, not rebellion against it. He understood that real faith isn't threatened by deeper understanding, it's strengthened by it. The hidden truth he revealed about Jesus' resurrection doesn't destroy Christianity. It elevates it to a level where it becomes universally relevant rather than historically specific. The behind-the-scenes motivation for the Church's resistance becomes clear when you understand what was at stake. If Jesus' victory was spiritual rather than physical, if his transformation represented a potential available to all consciousness, then the entire structure of religious authority shifts dramatically. Instead of needing priests, churches, and institutions to interpret divine will, every individual becomes capable of direct spiritual experience and transformation. Cayce's revelations suggest that the real heresy isn't questioning physical resurrection. It's limiting spiritual possibility to one historical figure. The true message of Christ becomes an invitation to transformation rather than a demand for belief. This shift in mindset opens up possibilities for spiritual growth that go far beyond traditional religious boundaries, allowing people from all backgrounds to find inspiration in Jesus' example without having to accept doctrines that their reason and spiritual intuition cannot embrace. What's particularly powerful about this understanding is how it addresses fundamental questions that have troubled seekers for centuries. Why would a loving God require blood sacrifice? Why would salvation depend on believing specific historical claims rather than on spiritual transformation? Cayce's insights provide answers that satisfy both heart and mind, revealing a spiritual logic that makes sense of Christ's mission in terms of consciousness evolution rather than divine appeasement. The journey that Cayce describes isn't just about what happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago. It's about what's possible for human consciousness right now, in this moment, for anyone willing to embrace the radical transformation that true spiritual awakening requires. Now, I want to explore the specific details of what this transformation actually looked like, according to Cayce's revelations, and how Jesus' post-crucifixion manifestations demonstrate principles of consciousness that we can understand and potentially experience ourselves. Write in the comments, transformation available now, if you're recognizing that spiritual evolution isn't just ancient history, but a living possibility in your own life. According to Cayce's revelations, the moment Jesus completed his earthly mission, his consciousness made a definitive decision that would change everything we understand about existence itself. The physical body that had served as his instrument for teaching, healing, and demonstrating divine love had fulfilled its purpose completely. There was simply no reason for an evolved consciousness to return to the limitations of flesh and bone when it had achieved something infinitely more magnificent. This is where the hidden truth about Jesus' post-crucifixion existence becomes truly revolutionary. Cayce described what happened as the emergence of what he called a body of light, a form of manifestation that maintained recognizable characteristics while being freed from every physical constraint we associate with material existence. This wasn't some ghostly apparition or psychological projection, but rather consciousness expressing itself through pure spiritual energy, creating a presence that could interact with the physical world without being bound by its laws. The impact of understanding this transformation explains so many puzzling details in the gospel accounts that traditional interpretation struggles to address. When Mary Magdalene encountered Jesus in the garden, why didn't she immediately recognize the person she had followed for years? When the disciples walked with him on the road to Emmaus, why did it take hours for them to realize who was speaking with them? When he appeared to the gathered disciples, why did some worship while others doubted what they were seeing? These weren't failures of perception or moments of confusion. They were accurate descriptions of encounters with consciousness operating at a frequency that transcended normal recognition patterns. The disciples were witnessing something unprecedented in human experience, a being who had successfully completed the ultimate transformation from material to spiritual existence, manifesting in a form that was simultaneously familiar and utterly beyond their previous understanding. Cayce's insights suggest that this body of light could appear and disappear at will, move through physical barriers, and present itself in ways that would be recognizable to those who needed to see it, while remaining essentially free from all material limitations. This explains the sudden appearances, the ability to pass through walls, the mysterious way Jesus could be present and then simply vanish from sight. What makes this understanding so transformative is that it reveals the resurrection not as a return to previous limitations, but as a graduation to expanded possibilities. Jesus wasn't brought back to life as we understand it. He demonstrated what life actually is when consciousness realizes its true, unlimited nature. The journey he completed represents the ultimate destination of spiritual evolution, the point where awareness recognizes itself as eternal and begins operating from that recognition. This ethereal presence that the disciples encountered wasn't less real than physical form. It was more real because it represented consciousness expressing itself without the constraints that physical bodies impose. The recognition difficulties they experienced weren't weaknesses in their perception, but natural responses to encountering something that operated beyond the ordinary parameters of human experience. But here's where Cayce's revelations become even more profound, because he didn't just describe what happened to Jesus. He explained how this transformation demonstrates universal principles about consciousness that apply to every soul-seeking spiritual awakening. Write in the comments, "Body of light manifestation," if you're beginning to understand how consciousness can express itself beyond the limitations we normally associate with existence itself. The revelation that Jesus returned as expanded consciousness rather than reanimated flesh fundamentally transforms our understanding of what resurrection actually means. Cayce's insights suggest that what the disciples witnessed wasn't a body coming back to life, but consciousness demonstrating its true nature as unlimited and eternal. This shift from physical to spiritual resurrection changes everything about how we approach our own spiritual journey and what we believe is possible for human awareness. What makes this interpretation so revolutionary is its universal applicability. If Jesus achieved this transformation through the evolution of consciousness rather than divine intervention unique to his nature, then the same potential exists within every aware being. Cayce's revelations suggest that we all possess what he called a spiritual body, a form of consciousness that can be developed and awakened through dedicated inner work and spiritual practice. This isn't some mystical fantasy, but rather the natural result of consciousness recognizing its true, unlimited nature. The impact of this understanding on faith itself cannot be overstated. Traditional Christianity asks believers to accept the resurrection as historical fact based on testimony from 2,000 years ago. Cayce's interpretation shifts the foundation of faith from external evidence to direct spiritual experience. Instead of believing in someone else's encounter with the divine, we're invited to cultivate our own capacity for expanded awareness and consciousness transformation. This creates a completely different mindset about what faith actually means. Rather than accepting doctrines that may conflict with our reason or direct experience, we're encouraged to develop our own spiritual perception and discover truth through inner awakening. The journey becomes one of personal transformation rather than belief in distant miracles. Faith stops being about accepting impossible claims and starts being about recognizing the infinite possibilities that exist within consciousness itself. The hidden truth that emerges from this perspective is that Jesus' greatest gift wasn't dying for humanity's sins, but demonstrating what human consciousness can achieve when it realizes its eternal nature. His post-crucifixion manifestations weren't proofs of divine power, but examples of awareness operating beyond the limitations that most people accept as permanent and unchangeable. This understanding removes the artificial separation between Jesus and the rest of humanity. Instead of being a distant savior figure, he becomes a way shower, someone who completed the spiritual journey that every conscious being is capable of undertaking. The resurrection becomes not just something that happened to him, but something that represents the ultimate potential of human spiritual evolution. When faith is based on spiritual experience rather than historical claims, it becomes infinitely more personal and transformative. Instead of hoping for salvation through external intervention, we begin developing our own capacity for transcendence. The decisions we make about our spiritual practice become crucial because they directly influence our ability to access expanded states of consciousness. The behind-the-scenes truth about this approach to faith is that it requires much more from us than traditional belief. It's easier to accept someone else's spiritual achievement than to undertake the profound inner work necessary for our own consciousness transformation. Now, I want to delve into the specific practices and principles that Cayce revealed about how this spiritual body development actually works and what it means for overcoming our own limitations and fears. Write in the comments, "Consciousness is the key." If you're beginning to see that spiritual transformation isn't about believing in miracles, but about awakening the miraculous potential within your own awareness. According to Cayce's revelations, what most people interpret as the ultimate physical miracle was actually something far more profound, a complete spiritual victory that demonstrates the true nature of consciousness itself. The resurrection wasn't about defying the laws of physics or bringing dead tissue back to life. It was about consciousness recognizing its eternal nature so completely that physical death became irrelevant, a non-event in the journey of awareness. This understanding completely reframes Jesus' entire mission and purpose. He didn't come to earth to prove that bodies could be resurrected or that physical death could be reversed. His deeper purpose was to demonstrate that the soul, the essential consciousness that we truly are, never actually dies in the first place. What we call death is simply a transition, a changing of forms, not an ending of existence. The impact of this revelation transforms our entire relationship with mortality. Instead of fearing death as the ultimate enemy to be conquered, we begin to understand it as simply one phase in consciousness's eternal journey. Jesus' victory wasn't over death as we typically conceive it, but over the illusion that consciousness could ever be limited or destroyed by physical circumstances. Cayce's insights suggest that by the time Jesus reached the cross, his identification with the physical body had become so minimal that leaving it behind was like discarding a worn-out piece of clothing. The body had served its purpose as a vehicle for his earthly mission, but once that mission was complete, there was no reason for an evolved consciousness to remain attached to material form. This analogy of the body as a garment is particularly powerful because it helps us understand our own relationship with physical existence. We are not these bodies any more than we are the clothes we wear. We inhabit them, use them, and when they're no longer functional or necessary, we move on. The hidden truth that Jesus demonstrated is that this transition doesn't represent loss or tragedy, but natural progression in consciousness evolution. The behind-the-scenes reality of what happened in that tomb wasn't a supernatural intervention or divine miracle in the traditional sense. It was the natural result of consciousness that had achieved complete spiritual mastery, no longer requiring physical form to continue its existence. The empty tomb wasn't evidence of resurrection, it was evidence of transcendence. This perspective fundamentally changes how we approach our own spiritual journey. Instead of hoping for external salvation or miraculous intervention, we begin to understand that our work is to develop the same level of spiritual consciousness that Jesus achieved. The transformation he demonstrated isn't unique to his divine nature, but represents the ultimate potential of human awareness when it recognizes its true, eternal identity. The decisions we make about our spiritual practice become crucial when we understand that consciousness development is the real purpose of existence. Every moment becomes an opportunity to either identify more deeply with temporary physical experience or to recognize our essential nature as eternal awareness. Now, I want to explore how this understanding connects with ancient spiritual traditions from around the world that have always recognized these same truths about consciousness transcendence and what this means for humanity's spiritual evolution. Write in the comments, consciousness transcends form, if you're beginning to see that what we call death is actually just consciousness changing clothes, not consciousness ending. What makes Cayce's interpretation so compelling is how it aligns with spiritual wisdom that has existed across cultures and millennia, long before institutional religions established their official doctrines. According to his revelations, Jesus' transformation wasn't an isolated miracle, but rather the fulfillment of universal principles about consciousness that advanced spiritual teachers throughout history had recognized and taught. In the ancient Egyptian mystery schools, initiates learned about the Ka and Ba, subtle energy bodies that represented different aspects of consciousness beyond physical form. These teachings described how evolved souls could inhabit luminous bodies after transcending material existence, moving freely between dimensions of reality without being constrained by physical laws. Cayce's description of Jesus' post-crucifixion state mirrors these ancient understandings almost perfectly. The Hindu and Buddhist traditions have always taught about the illusory nature of physical death and the eternal journey of consciousness through various forms of existence. Advanced yogis and meditation masters throughout history have demonstrated abilities that suggest consciousness can indeed transcend normal physical limitations. Stories of enlightened beings who could appear and disappear at will, manifest in multiple locations, or leave behind only light and fragrance at their death echo, remarkably, with Cayce's account of Jesus' transformation. The impact of recognizing these connections is profound because it suggests that what Jesus demonstrated wasn't unique to Christian tradition, but represents universal spiritual potential that transcends any single religious framework. His achievement becomes not just a cornerstone of one faith, but an example of consciousness evolution that speaks to the deepest aspirations of human spiritual development across all cultures. Cayce's insights reveal that Jesus' greatest teaching wasn't about establishing a new religion, but about demonstrating that matter has no ultimate dominion over spirit. By leaving his physical body behind, he showed that our true identity lies not in temporary flesh, but in the eternal awareness that continues its journey regardless of material circumstances. This understanding liberates us from the fear-based mindset that sees death as the ultimate enemy to be feared or conquered. The hidden truth that emerges from connecting Jesus' example with these ancient wisdom traditions is that spiritual transcendence follows natural laws of consciousness development, not supernatural interventions that suspend reality. What appears miraculous from a material perspective becomes natural when viewed from an understanding of consciousness as fundamental reality. This perspective transforms how we approach our own spiritual journey because it suggests that the same principles Jesus mastered are available to anyone willing to undertake the profound inner work required for consciousness transformation. The decisions we make about our spiritual practice become crucial because they directly influence our ability to recognize and develop these deeper potentials within ourselves. The behind-the-scenes truth about these ancient teachings is that they were often kept secret or transmitted only to initiated students because the implications challenge conventional understandings of reality so fundamentally that they can be disruptive to social stability. Now let me reveal how this understanding of consciousness transcendence can completely transform your relationship with mortality and fear, opening up possibilities for spiritual growth that go far beyond traditional religious boundaries. Write in the comments, universal spiritual principles, if you're recognizing that truth transcends the boundaries of any single religious tradition and speaks to the deepest possibilities within human consciousness itself. The specific details of how Jesus manifested to his disciples after the crucifixion reveal something extraordinary about the nature of consciousness when it operates beyond physical constraints. According to Cayce's revelations, what the disciples encountered wasn't a resurrected corpse, but something far more remarkable, a being of pure spiritual energy that could project itself into recognizable form while remaining fundamentally free from material limitations. This light body that Cayce described wasn't some ethereal ghost or psychological projection, but rather consciousness expressing itself through vibrations of energy that could be perceived by those whose spiritual sensitivity allowed them to register such phenomena. The disciples weren't hallucinating or experiencing wishful thinking. They were witnessing consciousness operating at frequencies that most human awareness isn't trained to perceive. The transformation in how Jesus could manifest explains the puzzling recognition difficulties that appear throughout the Gospel accounts. Mary Magdalene's confusion in the garden, the Emmaus disciples' failure to identify their companion for hours, the varying reactions when he appeared to the gathered followers. These weren't signs of poor eyesight or emotional confusion. They were natural responses to encountering consciousness that had evolved beyond the familiar parameters of physical existence. When consciousness operates as pure spiritual energy, it can present itself in ways that trigger recognition, while simultaneously transcending the limitations that normally define human appearance. The disciples were seeing Jesus, but not as they had known him in physical form. They were perceiving his essential spiritual presence, which could maintain familiar characteristics, while operating according to completely different principles than material existence. The hidden truth about these appearances is that they served a crucial purpose in maintaining the foundation of early Christianity during its most vulnerable period. The disciples had lost their teacher, their guide, their source of inspiration and direction. Without some form of contact with Jesus' continuing presence, the entire movement might have collapsed under the weight of grief and confusion. Cayce's interpretation suggests that these spiritual manifestations were strategic demonstrations designed to prove that consciousness transcends physical death while establishing a new model for how divine human interaction could occur. Instead of needing physical presence, spiritual connection could be maintained through expanded awareness and heightened sensitivity to non-physical dimensions of reality. The impact of understanding these appearances as spiritual rather than physical is profound, because it shifts the entire focus from miraculous intervention to consciousness development. The disciples who could perceive Jesus in his transformed state were demonstrating their own spiritual evolution, their growing capacity to register reality beyond material limitations. This creates a completely different framework for understanding how spiritual growth actually works. Instead of waiting for external miracles or divine interventions, we're invited to develop our own sensitivity to expanded states of consciousness and spiritual perception. The behind-the-scenes truth about these post-crucifixion encounters is that they represent a bridge between Jesus' physical ministry and the ongoing spiritual presence that could continue to guide and inspire seekers throughout history. Now, let me explore how this understanding of spiritual presence and consciousness manifestation applies to our own journey of awakening and what it reveals about the true nature of spiritual transformation that's available to every sincere seeker. Write in the comments, spiritual perception developing. If you're beginning to sense that there are dimensions of reality beyond physical perception that become accessible as consciousness expands and evolves, the universal spiritual lesson that emerges from Cayce's interpretation transforms Jesus' post-crucifixion experiences from isolated miracles into demonstrations of principles that apply to every conscious being. What the disciples witnessed wasn't just proof of Jesus' divine nature, but evidence that spirit can manifest beyond the limitations of flesh, when consciousness develops the capacity to vibrate at higher frequencies of awareness. This understanding completely reframes what resurrection actually means. Instead of being a literal return to physical life that happened once in history, it becomes a spiritual elevation that demonstrates the soul's fundamental immortality and its ultimate victory over every limitation that physical existence seems to impose. Cayce's revelations suggest that true resurrection is consciousness recognizing its eternal nature so completely that death becomes irrelevant, a non-event in the journey of awareness. The most transformative aspect of this interpretation is how it makes resurrection accessible as an internal process rather than a distant historical event we can only believe in or hope for. According to Cayce, every time we overcome our shadows, transcend our fears, and awaken to deeper spiritual light, we experience a form of resurrection within ourselves. Each moment of genuine spiritual growth represents a small death of the limited self and a rebirth into expanded awareness. This internal transformation process operates according to the same principles that Jesus demonstrated on a cosmic scale. The journey involves gradually releasing identification with temporary physical experience and recognizing our essential nature as eternal consciousness. The decisions we make about our spiritual practice, our willingness to face our limitations, and our commitment to inner growth all contribute to this ongoing resurrection that can happen within every sincere seeker. The hidden truth that Cayce revealed suggests that what we call spiritual awakening is actually a remembering, consciousness returning to awareness of what it has always been beneath the temporary illusion of physical limitation. This shifts our entire approach from seeking something outside ourselves to uncovering the infinite potential that already exists within our deepest nature. The behind-the-scenes reality is that this transformation doesn't require belief in any particular doctrine or adherence to specific religious practices. It requires genuine commitment to inner development and the courage to question everything we think we know about the nature of existence itself. The impact of understanding resurrection as an available internal process rather than a unique historical event is that it removes the artificial separation between Jesus and the rest of humanity. His achievement becomes not just something to worship, but something to aspire to through our own spiritual development. The eternal message that transcends all time and tradition is elegantly simple, yet profoundly revolutionary. The body is transitory, but the soul is eternal. Jesus' greatest miracle wasn't bringing flesh back to life, but demonstrating that spirit had triumphed over death by recognizing its fundamental indestructibility. This path of consciousness transcendence isn't unique to him. It represents the ultimate potential available to all humanity willing to undertake the journey of authentic spiritual transformation. The journey we've taken together through Edgar Cayce's revolutionary understanding of Jesus' resurrection reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness itself and the spiritual potential that exists within every one of us. This isn't just ancient history or theological debate. It's about recognizing possibilities for transformation that are as available today as they were 2,000 years ago. If you've stayed with me through this entire exploration, you've demonstrated the kind of sincere spiritual curiosity that opens doorways to deeper understanding. These aren't casual insights that you stumble across in everyday conversation. They're the kind of revelations that can genuinely shift how you see existence, mortality, and your own spiritual journey. I create content like this because I believe there are seekers out there who are ready for these deeper truths, people who aren't satisfied with surface-level spiritual discussions, but want to explore the profound mysteries that can actually transform their lives. If that resonates with you, I'd love to have you subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to uncover about consciousness, spiritual awakening, and the hidden wisdom that's been preserved across cultures and throughout time. For those of you who've genuinely absorbed what we've discussed here, write in the comments, "The Spirit is eternal." That way, I'll know you've taken this entire journey with me and these insights have found their way into your awareness. And if this exploration has opened something meaningful for you, a simple like on the video helps more seekers discover these conversations. It's your way of saying that this kind of content matters, that there are people ready for spiritual understanding that goes beyond conventional boundaries. There's a video right here that complements this topic perfectly, diving even deeper into how consciousness transcends physical limitations and what that means for your own spiritual development. Click and continue with me over there, because the journey of awakening never really ends. It just keeps revealing new dimensions of truth that were always waiting to be discovered. The path is there for those ready to walk it. The question is, are you ready to take the next step?